When I entered seminary in 2011, my interest was to learn about as many religious and spiritual traditions as possible. I wanted to develop the skills to help and support people who are actively in the dying process. Well, that was my plan. But you know that old saying, we make plans and God laughs. The first year of seminary was entirely about studying and immersing in these spiritual traditions. 1 month would be about Hinduism, the next month would be Buddhism, the next month would be Christianity and Judaism and Islam, and then indigenous religions, and then alternative spirituality, 12-step spirituality, death and dying, all kinds of fascinating, interesting processes to explore. Every month we would embody what it would be like to be a Muslim or a Hindu and practice and pray and study their wisdom traditions. I loved my first year. And then came along the second year. The curriculum primarily focused on rituals, weddings, baby blessings, worship services like these. I was completely resistant to doing any of that. I actually wanted nothing to do with worship services, rituals of any kind, baby blessings, weddings, none of it. I wanted to just study about spirituality. It wasn't my agenda. And then there was something introduced that really shifted my experience. There was something they had called the Names Project. And every month they would give us a list of names of people that spiritually impacted the world, whether they were of a religion or a humanist, even it didn't matter. They didn't have to be part of a religious tradition, but people that impacted humanity. And you would pick a name and you'd write a piece on this person. And the people I ended up picking were people like Jesus, Gandhi, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Peace Pilgrim, Matthew Fox, Karen Armstrong, and multiple others. I began feeling profoundly inspired by each of these people. And I realized that each of them were prophets in their own right. This was one of my favorite experiences of seminary. What is a prophet? The Hebrew word for prophet means spokesperson. Hebrew prophets were esteemed as the formal spokespeople of their faith or of God. Their messages were actions, and they weren't necessarily about predictions about the future. They were calls to society to become accountable for what was right, what was just, and to make changes. They were driven by something else. Prophets were not just against something, they were also for something. As much as they were trying to make changes, they were envisioning a new future and manifesting a just future. A prophet, like as I was saying before, is driven by their faith. Now, could a prophet be someone who's not religious? Well, absolutely. Why does faith have to be only connected to a religion or God? Can we not have faith in love? Can we not have faith in humanity? Can we not have faith in justice? These are all the driving factors behind the prophetic truth or the prophetic voice. So as part of UUCP, as I became part of UUCP, I realized that part of the calls of these communities is to have a prophetic voice. The call is part of, well, let me rephrase that. My understanding is that the prophetic voice is essentially a core value of Unitarian Universalism. A few weeks ago, Reverend Paul shared some teachings and some information about John Luther Adams. And for those of you who have not heard of John Luther Adams, or who were not on Paul's wonderful sermon, John Luther Adams is probably the most poignant theologian in the UU faith in the last century. And he talks about the 5 smooth stones that are the principles of UU traditions and congregations. And the 4th of these is what he calls the call for free and responsible search for truth and meaning. So he is quoted by saying this: prophetic congregations are places where people make history instead of being pushed around by it. Let me repeat that. Prophetic congregations are places where people make history rather than being pushed around by it. He shares that it's not enough to just be aware of justice. It means we have to speak out about it, and that we need to do it recognizing the inherent dignity and worth in every person. Now, I know that at this time in humanity, recognizing the inherent worth and dignity in every person might be very, very difficult. Yet, we are called to still strive to see this and do this. This is difficult work. And these are difficult times. During times like this, it helps for us to find inspiration. Who better to look at than the modern day prophets, those who have impacted and are continuing to impact our country and our world for equality, compassion, and justice. People like Malala Yousafzai, I don't know if I pronounced that correct, Angela Davis, Gloria Steinem, MLK, Stormy DeLaveray, Michelle Alexander, Malcolm X, Greta Thunberg, Jeremy Gilley. That's just names that popped into my mind. And the person I'd like to talk about today, who's been in our minds and hearts all summer, John Lewis. Let's look to his prophetic words for some inspiration. So he says, or describes, he says, when we were sitting in, it was love in action. When we went on a freedom ride, it was love in action. The march from Selma to Montgomery was love in action. We do it not simply because it's the right thing to do, but it's love in action. That we love our country, we love our democratic society, so we have to move our feet, he says. Amazing, right? He also shares, you have to be taught the way of peace, the way of love, the way of nonviolence. And in the religious sense, in the moral sense, you could say in the bosom of every human being, there is a spark of the divine. And you don't have to be right. You don't have the right. You don't have the right to abuse that spark of the divine in your fellow human being, regardless. So powerful. He says, I think in our culture, I think sometimes people are afraid to say, I love you. But we're afraid, especially in public life, as many elected officials or worldly officials are afraid to talk about love. Many people tend to think something that is there's something so emotional about it that maybe it's a sign of weakness. And we're not supposed to cry. We're supposed to be strong. But he says love is strong and love is powerful. The movement, he says, we created is like a call to a nonviolent revolution. It was love at its best. It's one of the highest forms of love. That you beat me, you arrest me, you take me to jail, you almost kill me, But in spite of that, I'm still going to love you. He goes on to say, I know Dr. King used to joke sometimes and say things like, just love the hell out of him. Just love him. What courage. Prophets aren't always the voice that serves them personally, but are the voice that serves justice and the right thing to do. And this is my take on something that John Lewis did. He supported same-sex marriage in the early 2000s, years before fellow African Americans and Democrats embraced the issue. And it was more than a decade before the Supreme Court legalized these unions. Lewis compared the struggle for equal rights for LGBTQ people to the work in the front lines of the civil rights movement. He, and I quote, said, I've heard the reasons for opposing civil marriage for same-sex couples. I've heard the reasons. He says, cutting through the distractions, they stink of the same fear and hatred and intolerance I've known in racism and in bigotry. And he went on to write that I've fought too hard and too long against discrimination based on race and color, not to stand up against discrimination based on sexual orientation. A few weeks later, the state Supreme Court ruled in Massachusetts, the first state to recognize gay marriage. So I want to go on and talk a little bit extemporaneously about the lessons from John Lewis and the lessons of prophets. First of all, I wanted to share a quote that was part of his dialogues recently with Krista Tippett on a podcast called On Being. The quote is, "We cannot become the beast to defeat the beast." It's a lot of work to become and stay mindful inside and not embody that same energy that we're trying to disrupt, to stop, to redirect, or to reimagine. And also there's another quote that comes to mind that I think is very powerful, is that we can't insult people into agreeing with us. At times like this, and being a liberal religious community, the work is not just outside of us, friends. It's even more so inside of us, so that we could come out of action with the least despair and anger that might embody in many of us in these trying times. And we have to be mindful of how despair and this kind of energy can overtake us. You know, justice work that we do can bring us into states of being very activated and aggravated and upset. And it's difficult to sustain. It's difficult to get up every day, read the news, and sustain the kind of ongoing activism or a prophetic voice, or however we want to describe the work that most of us do, whether it's in our conversations or as active activists. It is difficult. So the invitation is to find ways to embody self-care in our lives so that we could start that work within ourselves. The other thought that comes up in John Lewis's teachings, and I might not have included it in what I quoted, is that we have to be mindful, or the suggestion is to be mindful that what we are doing will not be completed in our lifetimes, or it's very unlikely that it will be. And we are invited to give up on the outcome of the goal and just stick to the goal of the work that we do. And it's the spark that we ignite and that we share in each other when we do this work that moves the world towards a more just and loving place. Sometimes we feel like we want to see the outcome, but we can't always see the outcome in what we're doing. And my dear friend and colleague in ministry and in so much of the work I do, Ty Holmes, I think he's on the call right now, is always my source of inspiration. And he shared with me some information he had heard the other day. And it's the story of this person, a gentleman who had witnessed the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge at that time in Selma in the 1960s, and he had witnessed the horrific actions that happened that day. And he wanted desperately to go down there and to take action and be part of the movement. And he couldn't. And he felt like what can make a difference? What can I do? And he decided he would take just an hour a week, and he would commit to just 1 hour to take action. And he started doing work, I believe, specifically in shifting the redlining that was going on in New Jersey. And the work he did ended up impacting the family of Cory Booker, allowing him to grow up in a neighborhood where he would not have had that opportunity had not been the work that this gentleman did with just his 1 hour a week. And now creating a whole voice that impacts our society and the world at large. So sometimes, we might feel that the smaller things that we do, or taking an hour a week, or having a significant conversation, doesn't impact the world. It's not enough. We're not these great leaders. But our world is impacted by millions of actions every day done by millions of people that don't make CNN, that we'll never know their names, and we'll never see their actions. But these are really the actions that make the most difference. Yeah, Malcolm X did amazing things. So did MLK, and so did so many other people that I mentioned. But what if they couldn't have done it by themselves? It was all the people that inspired with them, that took action, that made conversations, that might have marched or might have sided or might have spoken about it. But they're all the ones that made it all happen. So where I'm going with this is that your prophetic voice matters. Your prophetic voice can make a difference, even if it's just a little bit. And what if your voice is the voice someone else needs to hear to perceive something differently? What if your conversation is the one that will shift somebody's consciousness? What if you are the prophet we've been waiting for? What if we all are? Amen, Ashe, and may it be so.